Well, good morning, everybody. It's Barry Jones with SP History, and this is chapter 40. And we have been on a quest to understand the formation of the deep state and its relevance to the JFK assassination. We've been talking about LBJ, and I went into about a 2 hour discussion yesterday about Suite 8F group that LBJ ran out of Houston when he controlled state of Texas, and how when he became president or even vice president, he took that statewide racket, turned it into a nationwide racket, actually an international racket, and uh, really spent a lot of time focusing on the big oil people and their relationship and how closely they work together. Remember, the definition of the deep state is the national security apparatus, all the industries that feed it. There is no bigger industry that feeds the national security apparatus than oil. And so uh, that's part of the deep state. And of course, LBJ was their useful instrument in getting their policies, domestic and foreign, carried out in Washington so they could continue to make money. Today we're going to look at. I was supposed to include this in the LBJ Friends lecture, but I ran out of time. 2 hours is about all I can expect anyone to pay attention to. So we'll just finish it up today. And I had mentioned some of these because some of these were in the Suite 8F group. George Brown and Herman Brown of Brown and Root Construction. This was a Texas construction company that throughout LBJ's political career, his rise to power, they had filled brown paper bags with cash and sent it to LBJ in exchange for all sorts of government contracts to build dams. You know, one of the things I learned here recently, and I was told this. I haven't actually checked it on my own, but I was told while we were spending quite a bit of time recently in the state of Texas that Texas does not have any natural lakes. They're all man-made, which requires dams and reservoirs. And Brown and Root was very instrumental in building all those dams and those reservoirs. And those contracts were huge. They got through USDA, and of course, uh, LBJ, in his capacity as congressman and later as senator and Senate Majority Leader, was in the position to award those contracts or steer those contracts in the direction of his friends. And that's how Brown and Root really got on the map in Texas and nationwide, and eventually it exceeded beyond our borders. And they built pipelines, military projects, all sorts of things. And so it was a mutually beneficial arrangement, as are all of these sorts of things. When politicians get into power, lots of these industries, these companies view them as their meal ticket. So in exchange for cash, they get these contracts. This is how uh, these politicians go to Washington with a small net fortune or net worth, and then within a few short years, they're multimillionaires. In some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars with a net worth. They 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 hold the votes, and so that gives them power, which gives them access to money. So LBJ was their useful instrument. He was their, and Brown and Root was part of the cash cow that made LBJ rich. The prospect of a foreign war in Vietnam was set to be a boondoggle for Brown and Root construction. Lots of construction was going to need to be built, infrastructure, roads, highways, barracks for troop facilities, hospitals, airfields, communication facilities. They would have to dredge canals and rivers, build dams, just like they'd done in the state of Texas. However, JFK was proving to be troublesome to this boondoggle, because National Security Action Memo 263, which he signed in October of 63, was, quote, set to withdraw from Vietnam all the bulk of U.S. personnel by the end of 1965. In other words, it's not going to be a Vietnam War. So a company like Brown Root Construction, which had designs, we've been in Vietnam pretty much planning this war since the end of World War II. So this has been a long time coming, and all of a sudden this president comes in and puts an end to it. They've probably, this has been their business plan going forward. Vietnam, we're going to get these contracts in Vietnam, and now all of a sudden they're not. And JFK famously said in a speech in the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones that have to win it or lose it. And he's talking about Vietnamese, which he has characterized as a civil war, which means it needs to be settled by Vietnamese. And this is going to cost Brown and Root construction millions of dollars. Now, it's just not just them. Obviously, all those big oil people we're talking about are very interested in the war in Vietnam as well. But this is Brown and Root. And then everything changes. After JFK was assassinated, Brown and Root construction, Raymond Morrison Knudsen, and J.A. Jones construction, Halliburton Oil, which were given over 90% of all the construction projects in Vietnam. It was over $1 billion of government contracts. Brown and Root got so many of these contracts, they called them the Vietnam builders. And so you can see how LBJ's friends, this again goes to that point. I've heard so many people say LBJ had nothing to do with the JFK assassination. I've always been instructed that when you're trying to find the culprit in a crime, look at who benefited the most, or whose friends or cronies benefited the most. And of course, there's more to come, but Brown and Root certainly benefited, and they had a long established relationship with LBJ, who also benefited in the short term, not in the long term, but the short term. He benefited from giving his cronies the war that they wanted. And the only obstacle in the way to all that was JFK. But that went away on November 22, 1963. All right, we've talked about her before. I mentioned her quite a bit yesterday. I'll just quickly go through and review Madeline Brown. We're talking about LBJ's friends. And I made a point yesterday in saying you are whom you associate with. And that was something my dad taught me. And so as we go through all these friends of LBJ, you start to notice a pattern. Now, in Madeline Brown's case, she's not using LBJ for racketeering purposes, but she is important to the story because she becomes a witness. You know, she's in basically a sexual relationship with LBJ. She's not the only one. He had many mistresses, but she actually had a love child through him named Stephen Brown. She worked on and off for Jack Ruby at his Carousel Club, which gives her a unique perspective on the JFK assassination because she knew a lot of the players. And of course, LBJ supported her financially. Stephen tried to get proof through a paternity test that the LBJ estate fought him on it. He eventually died a very suspicious death in 1990. And that all happened within about a 2-3 year period. I told you the story yesterday about how he came out of that party, that meeting at the Murchison party, and whispered in her ear, "Those Kennedy sons of bitches will never embarrass me again. That's not a threat. That's a promise." And he said it to her twice. Then the next morning, he called her on the phone and repeated it to her. By the way, she was pretty young when she first met LBJ, as you see that top picture there. But focus on the picture on the right, and you see her, the mother, Madeline Brown, at a party, and her son, Stephen Brown, sitting next to her. If you see a picture of LBJ when he was a teenage boy, Stephen Brown is a spitting image of his daddy. And I wanted to include that picture. But let's talk about some more corruption here. Bobby Baker was brought to the Senate by LBJ, and he was appointed Secretary of the U.S. Senate. Really what he was a bag man, and he's the one that went around and collected. He was sort of the collections man. You know, he would help facilitate these deals with these companies that most of them at that time were coming out of Texas, who wanted LBJ's attention. They wanted his support, his votes, so they could get these big government contracts in exchange. So as to be a buffer between LBJ and the company, Bobby Baker was the guy who negotiated the price. He's the one they gave the cash to. He's the one that carried the paper bags around. He, some of these big companies that uh, negotiated contracts with LBJ or negotiated to get those government contracts through Bobby Baker and LBJ. Intercontinental Hotels Corporation, which needed permits for mafia hotels and casinos in the Dominican Republic. Bobby Baker helped facilitate that deal. General Dynamics, which is out of Texas, made fighter jets during the Vietnam War. It was the F-111 fighter. There was a TFX fighter contract that was a big deal too. General Dynamics had a very long-standing relationship with LBJ. A good book Bobby Baker wrote, Wheeling and Dealing, where he just sort of lays it out. He co-authored it with Larry King, how the wheeling and dealing worked. It's literally a confessional, which is why it says it's Confessions of a Capitol Hill Operator. And of course, after he got in big trouble, and at some point, trying to cover up was no longer necessary because it all got exposed. But of course, LBJ walked away scot-free because he became president. Bobby Baker took the fall. And you see that Time magazine cover there with the spider web behind his head. And that's to convey a point that this was a web that Bobby Baker and LBJ created with all these industries, these big companies, these corporations that depended on, for their big contracts and their survival as a company, they depended on LBJ steering those government contracts their way. And Bobby Baker was right in the center of all that. And so that, by the way, is the scandal that was breaking out right at the time JFK was assassinated. In fact, on the day JFK was assassinated, November 22, the Senate was holding a hearing and they were taking testimony from people with respect to the Bobby Baker scandal. And there's speculation, we don't know now because it all got shut down, but there's speculation that within weeks LBJ was going to be indicted. And that was going to be the cover for JFK to drop him from the 64 ticket. He was going to jail. And all they got shut down the minute he became president. This is, you can see the case was drawing national attention. Time magazine was on the verge of publishing, I don't know, it was a huge spread on this Bobby Baker scandal, and it would have put LBJ in jail. There's just no question. And that all got canceled. As soon as LBJ became president, they gave it the kibosh. So you see your headlines. This is in the news, and so Johnson was running out of time. This Bobby Baker scandal was taking him down. It was a corruption racket that went back decades because LBJ, by the time he becomes president, he'd been a fixture in Washington for decades already. And so all of the government contracts that had gone to these companies in exchange for all this cash that had come to LBJ funneled through Bobby Baker. The Senate was on the verge of getting testimony, so firsthand testimony from these people within these companies that could testify to the exact amount of money they'd paid LBJ. Bribes, basically. And of course, if they got Bobby Baker in a squeeze, the hope was Bobby Baker would turn on LBJ as well. So in the morning of November 22nd, witnesses say LBJ was on the phone just with people back in D.C. keeping tabs on the testimony that was being taken in the Senate. At the same time, he was gallivanting around Texas with JFK. He was extremely concerned about this Bobby Baker scandal and what was coming out about it. And there was an issue of time. He was running out of time. And incidentally, these companies were running out of time too, because you got to think about it from both perspectives. If they want this boondoggle to continue, they need LBJ to stay out of trouble, and they need him to become president, because now not only does it continue, it accelerates. He's the most powerful man in the world now, and they have immunity, full immunity, because they're in business with the president. There's not going to be an investigation. the Democrat Congress is not going to investigate one of their own in the White House. And so it was in their best interest that JFK be removed so that their guy could be in the Oval Office. And it was in LBJ's best interest that JFK be removed because he was going to jail otherwise. It was obviously in Bobby Baker's best interest. And all of these folks that are trying to make money through a Vietnam War, it was in their interest because JFK was the obstacle to the war. There's so many moving parts to this, but they all move in the same direction against Kennedy. Oops. All right, so that's Bobby Baker. How about Billy Saul Estes? Billy Saul Estes, this goes back, this even predates Bobby Baker, but this is, he was sort of a notorious con man in the state of Texas. People kind of knew him as that. And he had figured out a scam. And I'm sure it wasn't on his own. He was in business with LBJ, and LBJ and him together figured out the scam, which was to use federal money to, it's not his money. So now he can undercut the anhydrous ammonia market in Texas and undercut all his competitors with this cheap anhydrous ammonia market that farmers needed. And then when he drives them out of business, he can raise the price. This is how monopoly works. And he says, if you shatter an industry, you can pick up all the pieces for yourself. That was the whole point of it. If you've ever played Monopoly, you know how that works. You drive your competitors out of business, right? Or to bankruptcy. And then you undercut their price. Everybody buys from you. They go out of business. They go bankrupt. Then you raise the price, and now you're the only game in town. You can charge whatever you want. He also sold, and of course he's doing this because he has the advantage of having LBJ in his pocket, and LBJ's funneling all this government money to him. So he's not losing anything. It's not his money. These other guys are losing their shirts. Then he sold imaginary anhydrous ammonia storage facilities to these farmers who, they were so expensive, farmers had to take out mortgages on these tanks. And then when they couldn't pay back the mortgage, these things, are, like I said, they were imaginary, they didn't exist. They leased them back to Estes. Estes would buy them back from, of course, he'd buy them back cheap. So he would get paid a bunch on the front end and pay out a little on the back end. And this scam that he was running in the state of Texas netted him over $30 million. And of course, you're not going to get away with that for very long. And so Billy Saul pretty quickly becomes the focus of an investigation statewide at first, and then it spreads into Texas or into DC, and DC starts sending investigators down to look into this. And this is where LBJ comes in handy because he's in DC. This business arrangement started between LBJ and Billy Saul back in 1958. So this is 5 years prior to the assassination. So this is before LBJ even becomes vice president. He's Senate Majority Leader when this happens. And it was necessary for both. Obviously, LBJ, if you know anything about, if you study him for any length of time, you realize this guy was just after money. He was so greedy. He just wanted money. And so this was another revenue stream, income stream for him. And in exchange for these cash bribes from Billy Saul Estes needed protection from these DC investigations. So this business arrangement started with a cotton deal. I remember when I was first introduced to cotton and the politics of cotton growing, and not just cotton, but also like tobacco. When I moved out of Tennessee, I moved to Cheatham County. Cheatham County was the world's largest producer of dark fired tobacco. And I found out how it worked, and what the deal was is the government had restrictions on how much cotton could be grown in order to regulate the price. And they would give out allotments. You can grow 1 acre of tobacco. Same thing was with cotton. In order to artificially support the price, you had to artificially control the demand or the supply, right? So what Estes would do was he would get these allotments to grow cotton on, just like farmers who get subsidies not to grow uh, crops because it would exceed the allotments. Uh, he was getting these subsidies not to grow cotton on X amount of his land. Now he was growing cotton on some of it, but he was told not. Some of these allotments he was forbidden, and he was actually given subsidies not to grow cotton. But he was growing cotton on these. In other words, he was illegally growing cotton on allotments he wasn't supposed to, and he'd sell it, make a profit. And then he was growing it, and at the same time he was receiving subsidies from the U.S. government not to grow it. So he was double dipping. He's growing where he's not supposed to, and he's getting subsidies on the land that he's not supposed to, but he is. So he's selling the cotton and he's receiving the subsidies, and he did this for and as long as LBJ was in Washington protecting him, um, you know, he could do this. He'd get away with it. Estes' son said, quote, during that time, Daddy had been supplying Lyndon with large infusions of cash. Since these transactions were all cash, there's no really reliable way of knowing how much money went to Johnson or what became of it. This is how they started their business, and then it spread into the anhydrous ammonia thing. And in 1960, the USDA starts looking into it. You know, as I said, you're not going to get away with this for too long. Henry Marshall was the USDA inspector. And in 61, June 3rd, Marshall is found dead on his farm. He's lying in the grass next to his truck. Uh, Actually, he's kind of propped up against his truck a little bit. He was shot 5 times in the chest and left abdomen with a 22 bolt action rifle, and it was ruled a suicide. A suicide, bolt action, meaning he fires, he recycles, he fires, he recycles, he fires. Just impossible, right? Well, about a year later, the case was reopened, 62, and Marshall's cause of death was changed from suicide to homicide. So that means there's going to be an investigation, right? And this might be a problem. And if it was a suicide, there would be no problem. It just the investigation would conclude a suicide. But but it wasn't a suicide, it was a homicide, you can expect the guilty parties to be concerned and maybe take action to prevent that investigation from proceeding, right? April of 62, Billy Saul was indicted by a federal grand jury for 57 counts of fraud. So now they've looked into it, and in April they decided they've got him. 57 times he committed fraud, allegedly, against the U.S. government. And he was offered a deal in exchange for his cooperation, which Estes refused, saying, quote, I'd have been free for about 30 minutes. Then I'd have been dead. There are already some others who have gone that route, which was an interesting comment considering what happened to Henry Marshall. In 79, Estes, when he was confronted by Texas Ranger Clint Peoples, who was now investigating more of this later on, this investigation and the legal issues for Billy Saul just dragged on and on and on. I mean, for years. And he, according to Clint Peoples, Estes told him, quote, you may be assured that Henry Marshall very definitely did not commit suicide. This is going back to 62 when they found Henry Marshall was ruled a suicide. Peoples said, Billy Saul, which direction should I have been looking? Because it was Peoples who had been investigating that 15, 16, whatever years prior, and was frustrated by the fact that the coroner ruled it so quickly a suicide. And Estes says, well, you should have been looking at the people who had the most to lose. And Peoples asked him, should I have been looking in the direction of Washington? And Estes says, you are now very definitely on the right track. In other words, what Estes is saying is his business partner in Washington, he only had one. It was LBJ. And they were speaking in code, but they both knew who they were speaking about. And he says, he's the guy you should be looking at. He was his job. When I paid him cash, his job was to protect me and us in our little scam that we had going. And that was the way that he protected me and us by taking out Henry Marshall, who was investigating. Didn't work, at least not as far as Estes was concerned. He ended up getting indicted for 57 counts of fraud as well. But it did protect, or at least bought some time for LBJ. In 1984, so you see how long this drags out. This legal issues for Billy Saul Estes. This all started in 58. So do the math on that. That's 26 years. And the business that he'd been involved in with LBJ, starting in 58, continuing through 68 when LBJ got out of the presidency, we get to 84 and it's still haunting him. He's still being raked over the coals and investigated over this. Anyway, he's testifying before the Robertson County grand jury, and Estes now, after all these years of investigation, after LBJ has finally died, and after all this time where LBJ saved his own skin but did nothing to help Billy Saul, he's sort of had it. And he makes a charge to LBJ and Cliff Carter. Remember, Cliff Carter was LBJ's fixer. We talked about him yesterday. He said that LBJ and Cliff Carter were involved in the death of Marshall and that LBJ had given the order. So we're going to start seeing a pattern here of murder. This that's going to surround and follow LBJ and his entire political career. Unfortunately, we don't really find out the truth about it until after LBJ's death. There were suspicions, and people knew, but people were afraid. They were, we saw that he was afraid to testify when they offered him a deal. He said, "I'd be dead within 30 minutes." He knew what he's talking about because the guy he was in business with had killed Henry Marshall, and it gets worse. So this is a famous picture back in '62 when the law enforcement and the coroner ruled that Henry Marshall had died as a result of suicide. This is the sheriff demonstrating in court how he did it, and it's patently ridiculous. Here you see a bolt-action rifle. He's pointing at himself, and in court he's trying to demonstrate how he could have done it 5 times. Remember, it was 5 shots. So I'm going to save Mac Wallace for a separate episode. That topic deserves an episode to itself. So that concludes the this is sort of the addendum to yesterday's. So it's a separate chapter 40, but I'm trying to show a pattern where LBJ is capable of murder. A lot of people don't want to admit the fact that a president of the United States would even be capable of assassinating somebody, and that he had no role to play. And any hint of role is circumstantial. It's just rumor. Now, this is a long-running pattern, and he is involved in business with people that are, and there's financial motive to eventually take out somebody like JFK, because not only for his own sake, but for his cronies who want to make money. But there's also the aspect of trying to stay out of jail. And just like he was willing to kill Henry Marshall to stay out of jail, if he's willing to kill Henry Marshall, he's definitely willing to kill JFK, just to show a long-running pattern of LBJ in business with corrupt individuals involved in these scams and these rackets. And he himself was just as corrupt. And some of these were small timers like Billy Saul in comparison to H.L. Hunt, in comparison to Clint Murchison, in comparison to Brown and Root Construction, in comparison to General Dynamics. Some of these were facilitators who helped act as buffers or bagmen like Baker, Bobby Baker. One of the things you'll notice about LBJ is he understood the principle of ultra vires very well. He was all about profits. He didn't care about the public or the public interest, and he was all about immunity, immunizing himself. And if it meant he had to buy off the sheriff, if he had to buy off the law enforcement, he even had lawyers in his pocket, and he had judges. He had judges. We saw that in Suite 8F. One of the first guys I listed in that Suite 8F group was a prominent judge in the state of Texas. So and it wasn't just that, it was coroners too. One of the things that LBJ was one of the things he's most concerned about early on in some of these cases was making sure that his guy got in the coroner's office so that the cause of death in any of these jurisdictions, if it was his corner, he could be assured that the corner would protect him. I mean, he knew how to immunize himself. He's very good at that. So that's chapter 40. We'll continue with another friend of, and I wouldn't call him a friend, that's another useful instrument of LBJ. And part of this cabal, it's coming out of the state of Texas. Anything LBJ is involved in, it requires the use of lethal force. He wanted an in-house assassin, somebody he could control, was on his payroll, somebody that owed him his life and would keep quiet, so that he had, uh, like a mafia boss almost, his own personal hitman who could take care of problems and make problems go away. We'll talk about that in chapter 41. Until next time, thank you. God bless.